Today I get to talk about Sigmund Freud, and I really love talking about Freud. So here's where the class gets interesting. Up until now, I've just been going through some of the major religions of the world and throwing a bunch of terms out at you, but that's not what the class is about. It's more about why do we have religion. So I'm going to come back to Freud and talk about some of his theories and ideas of why we evolved to have religion. Now, when I talk about Freud was an atheist. So I'm going to put my atheist hat on for a minute today. And if you consider atheism as a religion, it's one of the biggest religions. Now, one of the ideas that Freud has from this viewpoint is this, that man created God in his own image. So he ascribed certain human attributes and put them onto God. And so I like this idea. It's personification. Why does God even have to be a person? I kind of think of God as energy. So when I get into this viewpoint, I forgot I had this quote of Nietzsche's, is man merely a mistake of God's or God merely a mistake of man? Another famous atheist here. I have this picture. I have it on here for a reason. Well, everybody knows God's a man, so God has a gender? I mean, is that right? And does God have a race? And does God have certain human attributes? Like I always say, he's an angry white man that sits up there waiting for us to screw up. I know that's not true, but that has been in the past where he took these certain attributes and we ascribed them onto God. Don't get me started on, the white Jesus thing either, because we've also made Jesus look a certain way based on cultural expectations. Okay, so enough about that. I have these quotes. The finality of death is the coldest truth one must face. Religion makes the perfect distraction. Freud says this right here. Religion is comparable to childhood neurosis. The whole thing is so patently infantile, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view. I kind of summarize it like this. Religion is a childish story that's perpetuated by people who are afraid of death. You're talking to the wrong person. I can't wait to die. I can't wait to cross over to the other side. Okay, so Stephen Hawking says this one last one. I regard the brain as a computer which will stop working when its components fail. There is no heaven or afterlife for broken down computers. That is a fairy story for people who are afraid of the dark. Wow. Okay, so to summarize this whole beginning about atheism, one of the things that religion does, according to the atheist, is help us cope with the finality of death. But another thing is that our lives really don't mean anything. I'll get into existentialism a little bit later. Okay, so this is one of the first major ideas that I want you to know about. And if you've been in my class before, you know it already. It's Freud's iceberg. He compares our mind to an iceberg, and if you notice an iceberg, the majority of it's under the water. Only the tip is sticking out. And he says the tip of the iceberg is what is currently in your mind, and most people think that this is what's in control. And Freud says, it's the down here, this is the part that's in control because it's the biggest part. Now, I don't want to go all Shutter Island, but usually in my other classes I talk about Shutter Island. I know I'm in control, right? It's like, no, you're not. Something else is in control. Okay, so the three parts of the iceberg are these. First part, the tip of the iceberg is called the conscious. That's what's in your mind right now. And most people think that's what controls my behavior because it's in my mind right now. Okay, so the conscious. The second part, preconscious. That's just below the water right here, if I can get my pen to work. And it would be like information that you can easily retrieve. Like if I said, what's 2 plus 2? Well, okay, the answer just comes right up here to the surface, 4. Or what's your mother's name? Or where did you go to high school? That information's in your mind, but it's not currently in the tip of the iceberg until I ask you. Now, those two parts don't really interest me or Freud. The part that really interests Freud is the bottom, the unconscious, because it's the biggest. And he says because it's the biggest, it's most in control. But ironically, we don't know about it because it's hidden from us. And so in my other classes, I go off on secrets because you're only as sick as your secrets, and your secret drives you. Shutter Island, what did she do to the kids in the lake, right? But I'm not going to talk about secrets today. I'm going to talk about primitive drives because he says we also push down or hide not only our secrets but primitive drives, and that we want to lock these away from ourselves and pretend like we don't have them. Okay, so I want to focus on this for a minute. Now, this is one of my favorite people right here is Cat Williams. I want to tell a story about Cat Williams because he does a stand-up routine about primitive drives and a tiger. Several years ago, two people climbed into a tiger cage, I think it was in California, and both of them got attacked and eaten and killed. Next day, the newspapers come out, the tiger went crazy, what happened? I can't believe the tiger killed him, we're going to have to put the tiger down, why'd the tiger do it? And Cat Williams is acting like, what? WTF? It's like, they climbed into a tiger cage. Nobody's talking about how crazy the people are. That tiger didn't go crazy. I tell you what that tiger went. That tiger went tiger. And so a lot of times human beings are going to go tiger because we've domesticated human beings into kitty cats. But if you don't believe this theory, just go on to the nightly news tonight and see how many people have snapped and gone tiger. Now, according to Freud, we have two primitive drives. The first drive we have is called eros. That is our life drive. Why does it have a big heart on here? Because he also equates this with our libido, our sex drive, that the two are kind of the same. Okay, so later on, Jung argues with him over this, and we could get into that on another day. The second drive, which I identify with, is Thanatos, the death drive, which is self-destructive, but it can be other destructive. And so you have the life drive and the death drive are our two basic drives. Now, I think I have a quote about Thanatos from Freud. He says this Thanatos usually would be internal self-destructive drive, and a lot of people do self-destructive things and hurt themselves and cut themselves and do all these kind of things. But a lot of times it's redirected, this instinct of destruction, onto the outside world. So I always say the meanest people are the people that have the most Thanatos or hatred towards themselves because they redirect it out onto other people. Okay, if I come back and put my atheist hat back on for a minute, religion in a way is just a social control mechanism. It's a way to control these two instincts we've been talking about, Eros and Thanatos. And so to go into more detail about this, I have this quote from Karl Marx. I forgot about this. I love Karl Marx. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature. It is the opium of the people. It keeps people down. I don't know if you remember me talking about the book of Eli. See, Eli here, Denzel Washington, he wants to keep the word pure, to use it to help people. But Gary Oldman in the movie, he says this about the Bible. It's a weapon aimed right at the hearts and minds of the weak and the desperate. It will give us control of them. And religion has been used in this way in the past. Okay, so back to Freud. Freud has this idea about people, that people have three parts. Not just our mind has three parts, but people do. Now, one of the parts that we have is called the id, ID. That's the animalistic part of us that works on the pleasure principle. Well, I call that the tiger. That we're all tigers, work on Eros and Thanatos. But we can't just be running around society just doing anything we want to just because it feels good. So we have to control the tiger. And he says there's another part of our personality called the ego. And the ego works based on social consequences or knowledge of reality. And so it's like, well, I might want to steal something to feed myself because I'm hungry, because I just want to do what feels good. But there's social rules and consequences that prevent me from doing this. Okay, so that's one way to tame the tiger. Now, the way I usually focus in on is the superego. Superego are moral laws, and specifically for this class, that keep the tiger in its cage. So even if I don't get caught over here, I'd still not do it because I would know. So I wouldn't go steal something because it's like, well, I didn't get caught, but I know I did something wrong. I have way too much superego in me. This is why I'm fascinated with serial killers, because they have none. They have plenty of ego. They know how to play with the cops and, know the rules and how to get around them and this, that, and the other. But they don't feel any guilt or sense of remorse if they don't get caught. Okay, so sometimes I like to think of these two things, if I can erase some of this over here, as like two leashes that are on the tiger. I have it represented like this. One of the leashes, or one of the control mechanisms, is social rules, and the other one is religious or moral rules. Now that could be either the church or something that I internalize myself. I usually focus on the second one. But these rules are used to control these instincts, Eros and Thanatos. And if you look at this quote right here, Mr. Sigmund Freud says it's impossible to overlook the extent to which our whole civilization is built on renunciation of instinct. I think I have one last Freud quote. The very emphasis of the whole rule, thou shalt not kill, makes it certain that we are descended from an endlessly long chain of generations of murderers. Wow. But you think about it, societies that don't have killers don't need that law. And furthermore, the killers had babies, they had babies, they have babies, they have babies, and that's us. Okay, so enough about that section. Okay, this is a new section, although it's very brief, but it's called the Oceanic Feeling. Freud had received a letter from one of his friends saying he had this trippy experience, and here's what he said: a sensation of eternity, a feeling as of something limitless, unbounded, as it were oceanic. So he focused on this word oceanic because a lot of people that have mystical experiences, and we'll talk about this later on in the class, say that they were at one with the universe, or they were, in this grand ocean of things. And so I'm going to come back to this and explain it in more detail. But one of the ideas that Freud has is not just his idea, that the act of birth is the first experience of anxiety. Why? Well, before birth, we're in this nice, safe, comfy place called the womb, and all of our needs are met, and we're connected to our mother with an umbilical cord. And then at birth, we're disconnected. We're ripped apart from this existence where it's nice and safe and comfy and warm and predictable, and thrust into a big, scary world. And it's like, oh, snap. What's going to happen? And we're also disconnected from our mother. We've had this connection, and now we're all alone in a big, scary world. So what I want to show you on the next slide, I'm not going to really show you. I'm going to play you this audio tape, and it's from Tara Brach, and she's a Buddhist, and she's also a psychologist. But she talks about this experience of anxiety in this big, scary world and how we deal with it.
The understanding of Buddhism and Western psychology in an existential way is that whenever we incarnate, there's a sense of a self in here and a world out there. There's some sense of separation. And so that in an evolutionary way, we're designed to identify as a self, identify as some separate entity, and then try to control our environment to make it. Science has discovered that we wake up 10 times a night to scan our environment to make sure there's nothing wrong. And then we fall asleep, and unless we have a sleep disorder, actually we don't remember that. But it's our evolutionary advantage to be vigilant. Creatures have to be vigilant, and there's an undercurrent of something is either wrong or could go wrong in any moment. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate to emotional suffering. Many mammals have emotions that are wired into them, many of the same emotions that we have. So it becomes interesting to sense, what is it that turns our rigging to have emotions into suffering? And in humans, what we have is a much more highly developed process of thinking, so that we can remember things from the past and plan in the future, unlike other creatures that we know about. And what this means is that when there's wounding, when there's some pain that we encountered, we have more access, more ability to dredge it up. We're motivated to bring it up so we don't have the experience again, and there's more of a compulsion to plan to avoid problems in the future. So that sense of something's wrong and the different ways that's expressed emotionally, whether it's shame or fear or anger, actually becomes a sustained state of mind. And our sense of who we are gets hitched to it. Most often what we're hitched to is the sense not only that something's wrong, but that something's wrong with me. And there's, in this culture, a lot that exacerbates that. We don't have much of a sense of natural belonging in our culture, and there's not a sense of real tribe or close community. So we each are given these standards that we have to meet in order to be okay, to be acceptable, to be lovable. And so we feel a sense of having to prove ourselves, to be special, to look a certain way, to act a certain way. And under that, the message is that our natural way of being is not okay. Now, this trance of not okay, of unworthiness, varies depending on our families and our genetics. When in a family situation we experience extreme kind of abuse or physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, then the wounding and the remembering and the obsessive thinking ahead are much more intense. But even when the wounding is not so obvious, our sense of not mattering, our sense of being invisible or not okay can be quite deep. I know in one story I heard, a family was at a restaurant and parents and young boy, and they were ordering their food, and the parents made their order, and then the child said, well, I'll have hot dogs, French fries, and a Coke. At which point his dad said, oh, no, you won't. You'll have meatloaf and mashed potatoes and carrots. And the waitress just looked at the little boy and said, so, hon, what do you want on that hot dog? The family were kind of stunned. They just sat there. She left, and he looked at his parents, and he said, she thinks I'm real. When we are not paid attention to in the way we need, when we're not seen, when what matters to us isn't taken into account, when we're not loved the way we need to feel loved, there's a deep conclusion that we make, that I'm not lovable, that I don't matter, that I'm not worthwhile. And those raw feelings often are so painful to feel that we then organize ourselves around these strategies to feel better, to not have to feel that core sense of fear, I'll be rejected, I'll be alone, of hurt, of shame. So what happens is we do a cover-up. We do what we can to cover up the vulnerability, what I sometimes call the unlived life, the tangles and the wounds that are too painful to just feel. And I sometimes imagine it like we come onto this earth, this difficult atmosphere, and we develop a spacesuit of strategies to navigate our environment, to win approval, to win love, to cover over the insecurity. And we each have a set of strategies. We each have a spacesuit, kind of a mask that we present. For some, it's striving and accomplishing and trying to prove ourselves through our doings. There's also ways that we try to make ourselves invisible, a cloak of invisibility. And then, of course, for many, there's some ways of deceiving or exaggerating or pretending that our experience is different than it is. And for many in this culture, addictive behaviors to kind of cover over that raw vulnerability, getting fixated and addicted to sex or gambling, to drugs, to caffeine, to being entertained. But the most basic spacesuit strategy that we use that keeps us locked in a sense of deficiency is judgment. We blame others, resent others, and then in the most core way, we're at war with ourselves. And it's a spacesuit strategy. We're trying to fix ourselves, trying to be a better person, trying to get away from that raw, powerless feeling of not okay. So in the trance of unworthiness, we develop these coverings, these strategies, and we get identified with them. They become what most tells us who we are. One of the stories in the Buddhist world that has drawn a lot of attention is of a old temple in the ancient capital of Sukhothai in Thailand, where there's this enormous clay Buddha that's been repainted and cared for over the centuries. Not considered a particularly beautiful statue of a Buddha, but revered because it had survived all these storms and invasions and so on. But in recent years, there was this stretch of hot and dry weather, and the statue began to crack, and one of the cracks was big enough that a curious monk took a flashlight and looked inside to see if he could understand the infrastructure, what was inside the statue, and what shined back at him was the flash of gold. and he and the other monks looked into some of the other cracks, and they discovered that inside the statue was one of the largest, most luminous gold images of the Buddha ever created in Southeast Asia. And what's interesting to me is that the monks believed that this statue had been covered with plaster and clay to protect it from harm during periods of conflict and unrest. It's kind of like the spacesuit, that in a similar way, we humans, when we encounter difficulty, and we all do, we cover over our innate purity with these strategies, these ways of protecting and defending and proving. And we do it so much so that we forget our essential nature. We think we're the spacesuit, and we forget who's looking through.
Well, I get all emotional over that video, but here we go. Here's a little spacesuit. And it's like really mystical experiences, or this sense of being at one with the universe. What Freud and others are arguing is really a desire to return to the womb. It's like almost like a subconscious memory, you know what I mean? It's like, and that we all kind of have the same experience, no matter what part of the world or what drugs we're on or whatever else, because we all have the primordial subconscious memory of being in that womb where everything was safe and comfy, and I just want to go back in there and want to be safe and comfy. I mean, that's what Cypher says. Don't you ever wish you'd taken the blue pill and just go back into the matrix and never woken up? And one of the things I like that she talks about on this video is that we cover over our vulnerability. I don't want to go Brené Brown, but if you don't know Brené Brown, B-R-E-N-E, Brown, you need to go look her up, because vulnerability is a superpower. And I'm sorry about the little sack boy on here, but I love Little Big Planet and Sack Boy. But, you know, I want to be vulnerable and be myself, but as soon as I just like, oh my God, it's a big scary world, and just like with the Buddha, they put all the clay on top of it, we cover over our own beauty. And I want to start crying right now because we're scared in that vulnerable state, and we just want to go back home. I hope I made sense. Okay, in this section, I wanted to revisit this idea of God the Father. And so Freud had a few interesting ideas to say about this. The first one is that he says our first God is our biological father. Why? Well, he's bigger than us. We're completely dependent upon him. He's our protector and our provider, hopefully. And so we revere our father. And then as we grow up, you know, we outgrow our biological father, and we still have this sense of vulnerability or fear. And so we created a big father in the sky. And so you can see what Freud says at bottom, God is nothing more than an exalted father. This is the big father in the sky. And so you don't have to remember this, but he says if you really want to know what religion does, look what it does for men. Number one, it tells them where they came from. How was the world created? This, that, and the other, all those stories. Number two, it tells them, oh, everything's going to be okay. You know why? This is my theory. Because Big Daddy's going to take care of it. Big Daddy, he's going to take care of it. And so we've invented Big Daddy, so psychologically we don't have to cope with all these scary things in the world. Because it is a scary world. There's death and mayhem and all kinds of bad things can happen, but Big Daddy's going to take care of it. So in this big threatening world, we get this sense of vulnerability, helplessness. And then this makes us invent Big Daddy or God. Because why? Well, one thing, he gives us reasons for the unexplainable, but this one over here is you can't see. Everything's going to be all right. And when it says everything's going to be all right, well, I call that the God Valium. This is what Tim made up. It's like, just take the God Valium. Anytime some bad shit has happened, it's like, God's going to make it all right. Okay, just calm down. It works for me, even if it's completely a phony thing. But I really love these ideas that Freud brings into play. Now, one of the other things he says is not only is God our protector, but he's also our punisher. Your real father is like this too. So based on these two things, you should have some ambivalence towards God, where you like God, but you hate God because he's scary and he can hurt you, but he can give you things. And so we're torn, have this cognitive dissonance about God. So I have to show you the next video. It's from one of my favorite comedians, and I think it speaks for itself.
Because I got to tell you the truth, folks. I got to tell you the truth. When it comes to bullshit, big time, major league bullshit, you have to stand in awe of the all-time champion of false promises and exaggerated claims, religion. No contest. No contest. Religion easily has the greatest bullshit story ever told. Think about it. Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you.
Okay, I hope you liked that as much as I did, but it kind of shows you that love-hate relationship we have with God, the ambivalence. Okay, so if there's no God, one of the things that this leads to is something called existential despair. Nothing means anything. We're just here to exist as long as we can, and then they throw your carcass in a hole. And this is why it's hard for me to read a lot of philosophy or get into atheism, because I've already got a dark mind. And so this existential despair, not all of existentialism is like this, but there's certain branches of it that really focus on people's struggle with this apparent meaninglessness, that's hard to say, of life. That life just doesn't mean anything. And so, I don't know, welcome to my world, existentialism. And so this is why I have to believe in a God. Because look at this one quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, and he's one of my favorite people. Every existing thing is born without reason, prolongs itself out of weakness, and dies by chance. It's like, dude, you need to like take some ecstasy or something. You're looking like you're a little bit too serious. And then there's this one from one of my favorite people. So existentialism doesn't always have to be negative. This is Osho. And here's what he says. I'm an existentialist. I believe in this meaningless, beautiful chaos of existence, and I'm ready to go with it wherever it leads. This might be my favorite idea of all time from Sigmund Freud, and that's saying a lot. He wrote this little book called Totem and Taboo, and he explains totemistic cultures, these cultures in which a human has a special kinship with an animal or plant. I'm totally into totemism. I mean, right here in Arizona, the Zunies, fetishes, all this other stuff. And plus, like I have the Haida right here tattooed on my arm. You could go on and on and on. This is the Haida. He's right up here at the top. But anyway, the system of belief has, existed in all these cultures around the world. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen this movie, The Golden Compass, but in The Golden Compass, they each have a spirit animal, and if their spirit animal dies, it's called a demon, then they die. And so I like that part of the movie. Okay, so back to the lecture at hand. I don't know if you've ever heard the story of Oedipus Rex, but this is where it gets crazy because Sigmund Freud is going to talk about the birth of religion from the Oedipal complex. So I have to briefly explain the story of Oedipus Rex to properly do this. Oedipus, according to Greek legend, was born to Jocasta and Laius. Well, before he was born, Jocasta and Laius went to the oracle and they asked, what's the destiny of our unborn son? And the oracle says, it's going to grow up and it's going to kill you, Laius. And so it's like, that's not a good destiny. And so what does he do? When the son is born, he gives Oedipus, baby Oedipus, to one of his servants and say, hey, take this baby out and kill it, because get rid of it. Well, the servant doesn't do that. He gives them to somebody that gives them to somebody that eventually gives them to a neighboring king. I hope I'm doing good right here. So this king raises Oedipus as his own. So Oedipus at a certain age, which is right here, goes to the oracle and says, what is my destiny? And the oracle says, your destiny is to grow up and kill your father. To kill your father. And he's like, oh my God, that's terrible. So when he goes home, he runs away from home so he won't kill his father. But see, that's his stepfather. I hope you're following me right now. Wish we were in class. Okay, so on the road, he gets into an altercation and he kills this man who just happens to be Laius, his father. Well, one of the things about Greek tragedy is you can't outrun your destiny, right? That's kind of like Final Destination. Okay. Well, so now when he goes into, I think it's Thebes, but I can't remember, they're without a king. And they say whoever solves the riddle of the Sphinx will become the next king. Well, guess who solves the riddle of the Sphinx? This guy, Oedipus. And unbeknownst to him, takes his rightful place as the heir to the throne. I hope you're following me. Now, as the king, he marries the queen that's there, which is Jocasta, and he doesn't know it's his mama, and they start having babies. I could talk about this all day long. Eventually, he finds out what he's done. He puts his eyes out, and this, that, there becomes a big fat tragedy, right? Well, for some reason, Freud has always gravitated towards this story, and this is where we get the Oedipal complex. And what he argues at a certain age, around 3 to 5 years old, boys begin to have this sexual desire towards their mother and wish to get rid of their father, just like Oedipus did. Now, if you were in my other class, I would go into all this detail about how this is about attention and not sexual attention, that I don't want to share mommy, or you're going to have to share mommy, and it has nothing to do with sex. But anyway, you can see with this quote right here, he says, our first sexual impulse is towards our mother, that's eros, and our first murderous wish against our father, that's thanatos. That's where he gets those two things from the material I presented earlier. Okay, so back to totem and taboo. Within tribal cultures, there's usually an alpha father. We call him the chief. And all the males are below him, subordinate. Okay, and so this is just like polygynous cultures, or I shouldn't say cultures, but animal societies where, there's the alpha male, and then all the other males are subdued underneath him. Okay, so here's what Freud's take is on the original sin, if I'm making sense. He says the original sin is not eating the apple in the garden. It's in one of these tribal cultures where you were supposed to revere the father, that one of the sons got jealous and rose up and he killed the alpha father and took his place, just like Oedipus. There was the blood sacrifice. But what about sleeping with a mama? Well, usually in this polygynous cultures, you have an alpha male and he has a harem of females and none of the other males can get to him. Why? Because you're not Big Daddy. And so now, unbeknownst to him, he's become and fulfilled that part of the Oedipal complex too. Okay, so I hope y'all are with me so far. But this is what Freud's idea is about the original sin. It's a blood sacrifice, but a different one than you're thinking about. Okay, so at first the tribe's all, oh, hell yeah, we got rid of that big ogre. He was like always in control of us. He had all the women, this, that, and the other. And then a few hours or days later, they just had this oh shit moment. It's like, why do we kill Big Daddy? We loved Big Daddy. Just like that love-hate relationship in the sky. We love Big Daddy, but we hate him. And so the tribe becomes torn. And this is what he says is the dawn of the superego. That before then you had tribal law, but you didn't have moral law. But this experience of guilt that they had on this first murder right here, the murder of the alpha father, led to the production of the superego. Now, I don't know if you buy into that, but this is right here. You can see the different religions have never overlooked the part played by the sense of guilt in civilization. And so that sense of guilt is kind of what we associate with the superego. And he says this sense of guilt began with the murder of the chief. So what does the totem have to do with all this? Well, this is what Freud argues. Once they've killed the alpha father, that they go out and they create a totem which represents the surrogate father. So it's a symbol of the father that they have killed. And so the Haida up here, which is like the raven, would be the symbol of the father. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the raven because I'm into ravens and that's what I think my fetish is. Okay, so here we go, a raven. So the raven, interestingly enough, in these like tribal cultures, there's these 3 periods that they observe. And each year they will go out, and normally you can never touch a raven because it's sacred, it represents the Father, but one day out of the year they'll go out and get one, and they will kill it, murder it, and eat and drink its blood. Okay, are y'all with me? And like have a big party. Okay, that's this day. The next day they go, oh shit, what do we do? That's the period of mourning. And then finally they recreate the totem and say, hey, nobody can fuck with the totem for the next 364 days. Okay, so here you destroy and eat the totem, if I can get this off here. And then here you recreate and revere the totem. Are you with me so far? I wish you were there, okay? And so these 3 periods are very interesting because they come out of that guilt of killing the Alpha Father. And so what they really do is they reenact the killing of the Father each year in memory of how they killed the Father. I'm getting goosebumps right now. I'm not kidding. I'm getting goosebumps right now. Because there had to be a blood sacrifice. I don't want to start crying, but I am. There had to be a blood sacrifice. And what he says is that this continued, and this blood sacrifice is the beginning of Christianity. And this is a really wild idea to go from the edible complex to the birth of Christianity through tribes, but this is what he says. He goes, why does Christianity do the same 3 things? Jesus was God in human form, right? And what did we do to Jesus? We killed him. We killed him, but we shouldn't kill God. We should revere God, right? And so we kill the Father with the blood sacrifice. It had to involve blood, according to Freud. And then we go through these 3 periods. Oh my God, I'm going to start crying. It's like we have this period of celebration right beforehand. We call Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, where we go, the King is dead. We did it. Yay. Carnival, it's all about carne, meat, flesh. We get fleshly, act like pagans. And then the next day we have an oh shit moment. What did we do? And then we go into mourning, and it's for, whatever, that 40-day period. And then we come out of that 40-day period. What do? Say, nobody touches the Father. Easter Sunday, he is risen. That's so weird. Tell me that's not weird. It's the weirdest thing I've ever heard. And so when you look at the Passion Play and the life of Jesus, he's saying it's just the reenactment of what's been going on all along. And so the Eucharist, or the communion, is interesting because what did he say at the Last Supper? Just like with the raven, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Eat my body and also drink my blood. Oh my God, is that crazy? And so every day when I go to Mass and I look, the priest, he blesses whatever the host, and he, talks about the cup. It's like, what's interesting is, the wafer, the host, the Eucharist. You know what the Native Americans, they call it the same thing in a way. Do you want the host? It's the flesh of the gods. Eat the flesh of God. Eat the flesh of God. We'll get into this when we get into mystical experiences, but I believe, yes, this is the sacrament. This is the sacrament that gets you close to God, but that's my kooky, crazy idea. Okay, so enough about that. When we talk about the totem, you say, oh, well, totems are like these totem poles and they're worshiping a raven. What does that have to do with Jesus and Christianity? Well, what do? We worship these totems, especially I'm a Catholic, so there's all kinds of totemistic things. And, here's the host. We revere the host. We call it adoration. It's like I have, whatever, my rosary in the other room. So there's all these symbols of the Father that we killed, and we reenact the killing of the Father each year in the Passion Play. I hope you liked that part of the lecture. I'll see you next time.